Some hospitals, in the wake of mandates, are finding themselves with shortages. If you remember, not too long ago, the hospital in Texas that said that they were going to mandate, everybody in the hospital. And of course, if you look today, that hospital is now short on staff, especially when it comes to nurses. There's certain staff members that you might be able to get away with not having. You might be able to get, maybe you don't have a respiratory therapist, the nurse can step in and assist the doctor with an intubation. In fact, in the ICU, that happens fairly often. You might not need a respiratory therapist to give treatments. Nurses can give respiratory treatments as well. And it's just good to have. Sometimes, just good to have more staff that kind of specialize. At times, nurses don't have aides. We can do the job of an aide as well. And you only need so many doctors because in emergency settings, a nurse can call up a doctor who is potentially on another floor and take a verbal order until that doctor is able to put in an actual physical order that will be reviewed by a pharmacy, and that's typically in an emergency setting or in an emergent setting or an emergency setting. You have a patient that is crashing, the nurse will call the doctor. If the doctor is busy, maybe in the emergency room, or then maybe they're handling another emergency, you call up the doctor. This is what's going on. The doctor will say, do this, right? Because you don't let the patient suffer as a result of not having a physical order per se into the computer. And some hospitals are realizing that nursing shortage is a bad idea. And as a result, this came out actually on August 30th. This is some hospitals are foregoing vaccine mandates to avert staffing shortages. In fact, I even posted this previously talking about Nebraska. Nebraska is recruiting unvaccinated nurses to plug a staffing shortage, because who's the one that's going to be at the bedside? Who's the one that's going to be drawing those labs? Who's the one that's going to be administering the medications? And the problem is if you have too high a patient to nurse ratio, it just ends up with bad care and people die anyway. So for all the people that are like, oh, you have all these unvaccinated, you're going to spread the disease. In the case of a shortage and there's not enough nurses, patients are going to die regardless because they're not getting adequate care. Their nurse is not able to pick up on perhaps emergency situations where it happened to me. I came back one day, it was one of my experiences. I came back from break. I got caught in the rain. I didn't when I was on my way back from the deli. It was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and my shoes got soaked. I had to take my shoes off, and I put on a pair of hospital socks. And I had a patient who came in for chest pain, came in for an MI, and he was actually, his wife was a critical care nurse at another hospital, and so he was my patient. And I see on the tele monitor a run of VTAC immediately. Run into the room. Patient's non-responsive. Initiate CPR when the patient becomes non-responsive, goes into VTAC arrest. And in those situations, if your nurse is too busy, let's say it was a really busy night, and maybe I was in another room on the floor that I worked, we didn't have a like a tele person, like a teletech, someone that just stares at all the monitors. Not at least on our floor. We did have them like in another completely different hospital, and they would just call you over the phone. But if you're in another room, how are they going to reach you? Right? If you're in another room, how are they going to reach you to let you know, hey, go check in on your patient, they're having a run of VTAC? And so in those scenarios where nurses need to be able to pay attention, because it only takes just a matter of seconds between a person who's having, a normal heart rhythm to an abnormal heart rhythm, and it can mean the difference between life and death. And so some hospitals are being forced to realize maybe this mandate ain't that great an idea, because many people are just either going to retire. Some of your well-seasoned nurses who have been nurses, especially in critical scenarios, if you need someone in ICU or in the PACU, nurses that typically are specialized. It's not like you can put a floor nurse and then have them go and do dialysis and go do CVVH in an ICU. That's just not going to happen. And so while they might be able to maintain as the patient as best they can in an ICU setting, if you haven't worked in an ICU setting, you don't have the skills and the experience, more importantly, to know what to do in an emergency setting, you're going to lose people. You're going to lose nurses, and you're going to lose patients, more importantly, and you're going to end up being sued. So the article goes on to state, it says in rural northeastern corner of Missouri, The Scotland County Hospital has been so low on staff that they've sometimes had to turn away patients amid a surge in COVID. And that's just a reality. If you got too many patients, you realize, you know what? We cannot adequately care for all these people. And so what could happen is that everybody dies. Then you can't save nobody because you've got too many people stretched too thin, not enough interventions being done in an adequate amount of time. And so what happens is everybody suffers and you end up losing too many patients. So hospitals have to make hard choices. It says the national COVID staffing crunch means CEO Dr. Randy Tobler has hired more travel nurses to fill the gaps, and prices are steep. There's what he called crazy rates of $200 an hour or more, which he says his small hospital cannot afford. There's a little over 60% of his staff is fully vaccinated, even as COVID cases rise. How odd. It says a vaccine mandate is out of the question. He says, if that becomes our differential advantage, we probably won't have one until we're forced to have one. Forced by who? By the government. It says, Tobler says maybe that's a thing that will keep nurses here. And I really kind of doubt that, because nurses are the ones who are on the ground. They're the troops that are on the ground. They see the stuff that perhaps you don't hear about every day on the very highly censored mainstream media. And so if many of these nurses are just not opting, you got 40% of your staff that are just not willing to take it unless they get forced to. That says a lot. That says a lot when nurses who are very much required to understand medication, they need to be able to catch the mistakes of the pharmacists. You need to be able to catch the mistakes of the doctors. If you have new doctors, you have new residents that might not know what the procedures are for this particular hospital. And so you have to have an in-depth understanding of that entire scenario. You have to be able to say, oh, doctor, you input this order incorrectly, or the pharmacist clears a medication, but it's not suitable for the patient. Doctor writes in an order, oh, but that doctor, you forgot that patient has an allergy, and the pharmacist clears it. But you as the nurse, you were the last line. And I've had pharmacists tell me that exact same thing. I had a pharmacist send me up 2 milligrams. Like, I don't know if it was like an antibiotic order, and the order was for 1 milligram, but he sent me 2 milligrams. The pre-printed label from the manufacturer said 2, but the pharmacist put a label that on top of it that said 1. So he made a mistake. The doctor put in the correct order. The pharmacist grabbed the wrong medication and put the 1 milligram label on top of it. But when I looked at the actual medication itself and not the pre-printed label, it said 2. So I called back the pharmacist and I said, hey, you're the one, you sent me up 2 milligrams. The order is for 1. I was like, you got to be careful. And he straightforwardly told me, he said, at the end of the day, if you would have given it, it would have been your fault because you administered the medication. And that's the reality. As a nurse, we are the last line. If a doctor makes a mistake, if a pharmacist makes a mistake, if a tech makes a mistake, if respiratory makes a mistake, every single nurse knows at the end of the day, who do they point to? They point to you as the nurse, because you are the last line. It is the nurse's responsibility to advocate for their patients, even against doctors' orders. So he goes on to state, it says, as of Thursday, it says about 39% of U.S. hospitals have announced vaccine mandates, which means 61% of U.S. hospitals haven't. This is Colin Milligan. There's a spokesperson for the American Hospital Association. It says, across Missouri and the nation, hospitals are weighing more than patient and caregiver health is deciding whether to mandate the vaccine for staffers. It says the market for healthcare labor strained by more than a year and a half of coping with the pandemic. And there have been many nurses, many of the ICU nurses where I worked at previously at New York Presbyterian, retired. Right after the pandemic, once everything kind of calmed down, they lost, I think, about between 7 and 9 of their long-term ICU nurses who had been ICU nurses for, or had been nurses for the better part of 20 years. And so you lose the wealth of that experience. Some people were fearful of catching the disease. Some people were like, you know what? I'm at my time, where I can retire. And they're like, you know what? Maybe this is the right time. I've been a nurse a long time. I'm just going to opt out and leave, especially in scenarios like this where, you know, nurses are like faced with taking a vaccine that maybe some of them are a little bit more educated than you about. They've opted to say, I'm going to retire. And so patients, doctors, the hospital loses out on the wealth of experience that these nurses have built up. And so hospitals are realizing this might not be the best way for us to go about doing business, because at the end of the day, hospital is there to do business. They're there to make money off of healthcare, and having patients die as a result of poor staffing and inadequate nursing is just not the way to go. This obviously is going to be a real challenge for these small rural hospitals to mandate a vaccine when they're already facing such significant workforce shortages, said Alan Morgan, head of National Rural Health Association. And so especially what they talk about is actually quite true. Most of the jobs that I've been offered are typically around, let's say like 85. I've been offered up to $100 as a travel nurse. One of the hospitals here in Mount Sinai, they were trying to get me to take a travel position for where they were offering well over $100, but they required the vaccine. And I was like, you know what? I was like, I'm not going to take it. It's not worth it for me to take it as a nurse just for the money. When I've already done my research. It's not like I haven't taken vaccines. You got to take vaccines before you can walk into the hospital. You take a flu shot roughly every year, even though I know for the most part flu shots don't do nothing, but I know it doesn't cause the sort of side effects that other vaccines do, especially when people say, well, it's supposed to do this, but then when I look at the data, I'm like, I'm not really seeing that. Not really seeing what you're telling me that it does, which is kind of one of the reasons why even lately you have the CEO of Pfizer, right? This is Albert Bourla, right? CEO of Pfizer. And he recently came out with, on September 1st, right? Success against COVID-19 will likely require both vaccines and treatment. And of course, surprise, surprise, Pfizer says, hey, we're already 2/3 of the way of a study for an oral antiviral candidate that you're going to take twice a day. And who is it for? It's for the non-hospitalized, low-risk adults. Well, most people who get COVID are low risk. It's like, I think it's only like 5% or so of people, maybe even 10%. Let's just say 10% of people. I don't even think it's that high, but let's just say 10% of people who actually get COVID-19 make their way into a hospital. If you remember, during 2020, there were so many news outlets that were stating that most people didn't even realize they had it, right? There was all that whole asymptomatic spread, you were testing positive, etc., right? So you had all these people that had such mild symptoms that they didn't even realize they had COVID. You got Joe Rogan just recently talking about that he had, he was feeling a little under the weather, had a little bit of a headache, so he isolated himself away from his family, got himself tested. They tested him positive for COVID, took all his vitamins, took all whatever it is that he needed, went into the hospital. He got some ivermectin along with some IV therapy, took some other vitamins, D3, zinc, etc. And then he said 2 or 3 days later, he's like, I'm feeling much better.
Hello, friends. So I got back from the road Saturday night, feeling very weary. I had a headache and I just felt run down. And just to be cautious, I separated from my family, slept in a different part of the house, and throughout the night I got fevers and sweats, and I knew what was going on. So I got up in the morning, got tested, and it turns out I got COVID. So we immediately threw the kitchen sink at it, all kinds of meds, monoclonal antibodies, ivermectin, Z-Pak, prednisone, everything. And I also got an NAD drip and a vitamin drip, and I did that 3 days in a row. And so here we are on Wednesday, and I feel great. I really only had one bad day. Sunday sucked, but Monday was better. Tuesday felt better than Monday, and today I feel good. I actually feel pretty fucking good. That's the good news. The bad news is we have to move the Friday show in Nashville.
And so you have such a small portion of the population that end up making it into the hospital. So why would you, as an individual who is, as he states it himself, is low risk, why would you take a medication that is rushed out the door? It's kind of like Every time I pass by my barber and I'm like, what do you think? Do I need a haircut? Is my barber going to say no? No, my barber's going to say, yeah, come in. We'll give you a shape up. Don't worry about it. No, we'll cut it down. We'll trim it down nice. We'll work on the beard, right? Why? Because he wants that money. If you ask a vaccine manufacturer, do you think I need another dose? I'm not getting the results that you're telling me. I say, hey, don't worry about it. Just take a third dose, right? And it just goes at the end of the day that people have to be willing to think a little deeper about what's going on. Of course, I'll leave all of the links. Here is the link to the actual Pfizer information right here for the oral candidate. Right, it says first participant dosed in 2/3 study of oral antiviral candidate in non-hospitalized adults who are low risk and of severe illness. But the people that you need to take care of are the ones that are high risk, right? Because 80% of all COVID patients were obese, with a long list of other symptoms: diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, etc. So it goes on to state here that there's a double-blind study with approximately 1,100 participants. I would want to know, well, who are those participants? Are you putting in people, are you padding it? Are you putting in young people? Are you putting in people who are very low risk and then giving them this medication and be like, you see, it works, right? So you got to be smarter than that. You have to understand that perhaps things are not exactly as they seem. I'm going to leave it here if you guys want to read the rest of these articles here for your enjoyment and, of course, for educational purposes. You're welcome to do so. Of course, as always, all links are at the bottom in the description box. And, of course, one last point, we're even seeing some countries that are just opting, like, for example, Portugal. Right, for those who are like, I need a place to move, Portugal might be the place for you. As it goes on to say, it says British visitors to Portugal no longer have to be double jabbed and will only need a COVID negative PCR test or an antigen test, right? If you show antibodies, they'd be like, come on in, spend some time in Portugal. So it might be a new vacation spot for people who are looking to travel. Anyway, I'm going to leave it here. Thank you for watching. And of course, feel free to comment and like, and don't forget to subscribe.